firstly, I guess I'd just like to say thank you very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be invited here today for a planned talk. Now, I know that you wanted me to talk a bit about my childhood, but I'm going to make it very brief. I was born in Norway and I grew up in Ireland. We moved there when I was 6 years old, and then I moved to London when I was 15, nearly 16. I left school way too young, and if I'm ever asked about a regret, then it's that I didn't take advantage of the opportunity that all of us as women have in the developed world, which is to go to university. Even if it's a struggle, it's still there as a possibility. And there's an awful lot, in fact, millions and millions of girls in this world today who will never have that choice. And it's one of the things that Plan are obviously fighting very hard to try and change. And many of the authors that I talk to on my open book program on Radio 4 discuss how growing up in a country that isn't your own can make you feel a bit like an outsider. But for me, I feel that it gave me the ability to look at things in a way that acknowledged and celebrated difference. And although my Norwegian roots are very distant from me now, I've got two important assets from that time. One was a very beautiful old paste Victorian brooch of my grandmother's, which I inherited. And the other is a quote from the phenomenal Norwegian writer Sigrid Undset from her novel Kristin Lavransdatter that says, "All my days I have longed equally to travel the right road and to take my own errant path." And that's a sort of, choice that I've battled with along the way, all the way through my career, really. And now, Jude, something that you said in the talk that you did for Plan really stuck out for me. And it's particularly poignant because we're talking about Malala, and she's been very much a feature of these talks. Because you were talking about the words that are used to describe girls, which are seen to be negative. And one of those words you used was precocious. Which is a way I've described myself as a child in the past, and now I find myself using very frequently about my very precocious daughter. And you were saying that you too thought of your younger self as being precocious, which I think in many ways is a word actually associated with negative things and shouldn't be, It's interesting because I think the word precocious, which actually means forward or premature, and would be used to describe an unusually developed talent, so Mozart was precocious. I think with young women, and certainly, I was using, and have used the word in this way too, precocious can be associated with very sort of assertive self-expression or self-acknowledgement, and it can be seen in a negative light associated with aggression or ambition, which are, obviously things that girls shouldn't be. And considered to be masculine traits. But actually I was brought up with a father who was a journalist and an artist mother, and so from a very young age I was surrounded by people who believed very strongly in communication, and in communicating both the problems that you can observe around you, which is perhaps more the journalistic strain of my family, and also your own emotional experience and intellectual reality, which comes more, I suppose, from my mum's creative side. And when my dad died and precipitated my precocious move to London, for me that was an extension of this kind of resilient determination to communicate my identity that I'd been immersed in both by my parents and to an extent within my heritage. I did want to walk the right road, but I also had a desire to travel this errant path that Undset writes of, to be an individual and also to carve out my own niche in a way that represented the larger world that I believe in. So I think that my precociousness was in fact a feeling I'd been given an inheritance too from my roots and my parents, and very much the ingredients that we as women have to take ownership of in order to make a difference in our own lives and in the lives of other people, without the confidence of expressing yourself, and that is something really that often comes with education and occasionally comes as a result of your parents. I think in my case it was as a result of my parents, because I left school too young for it to have really formed me enough in that way. Anyway, I arrived in London at 15, alone, fresh off the ferry, with a few carrier bags and the address of a squat in West London. And I had absolutely no plan, really. But I knew myself, and I was confident that I could make use of my capabilities. I didn't know in what way or what I'd do, but I knew that I wouldn't subside. I knew that I wouldn't disappear under the pavement. And in a way, that's all I've really continued to do in terms of work for the rest of my life, is just take whatever opportunity, whatever exciting thing that falls into my path, and do what I can with it, and try and fight the feelings of insecurity in the sense that, you know, I can't do that, I don't know how to do that, I've never judged the Booker Prize, are you mad? You know, and you have this voice all the time telling you that you can't do these things, and you have to ignore it, and you have to go, you know what, the worst thing that's going to happen to me is I'm going to make a complete and total fool of myself. And quite honestly, I've done it many times, and it doesn't feel nearly as bad as you think it's going to. That would be the only bit of wisdom you may hear from me tonight at all. Anyway, having fought plenty of battles personally, you know, in the way that every woman would recognise, you know, when it comes to career and when it comes to being, you know, appreciated and taken seriously and balancing everything, I finally became involved in fighting for gender equality and working for the rights of women and girls. It's something that funnily enough, my mum was very involved in Ireland. She was one of the leading lights of the feminist movement in Ireland. But they were a curious lot, because most of them never worked a day in their lives, but they spent it was very like Mary Poppins, you know, where they were always off waving banners and doing things, but in the end, you know, and I don't think that was purely out of choice on their part. I think it was a very, very difficult time, you know, for a woman to step out and take opportunities. But now, you know, and I've said this before, when the result of 50, and in fact closer to 100 years of feminism as a movement still leaves thousands of women and girls, millions of women and girls all over the world denied the right to education, in some countries denied the right to inheritance, see so many women still subjected to physical and sexual violence, or when we witness terrible things, the abortion of female fetuses and practices like FGM, for me it completely ridicules the principles of equality that we purport to have achieved in the Western world, because if we can't export it and if we can't change the lives of, you know, our sisters across the globe, then what good is it that we can wear whatever clothes we want and get a job? You know, frankly, it becomes almost worthless. And I'm always careful to be aware that different cultures and communities have different wants. And for a very long time, you know, I remember people telling me for decades, you know, oh, you know, in the African village, you know, women rule the village. But that's just a complete fallacy. You know, the truth is that they rule as much as they're allowed to rule. And until that changes, it's not a cultural thing, it's a basic human right. It's a basic human right that the money that you earn is yours to spend on your children, on yourself, on your husband, on whatever you want to do with it. It's a basic human right to know that you're not going to be beaten up by someone and have no recourse to any form of justice whatsoever. So I think that while it's very important to be aware of different cultures and communities and their different ideals, and that a generic idea of sort of Western female empowerment isn't going to match up with that of women worldwide, I also think that true empowerment is giving women the right to choose. And if that means the right to be precocious and to stand up and say, you know, that she wants to take the errant path, and that's what we should aim for. And again, going back to Malala, you know, it's exactly what she's doing, and she's an amazing force. She's a girl who's standing up against all of the trouble and violence and attempts to silence her and say, I will not be intimidated, I will speak. And what I would really love to see is every girl in the world feeling that she has that opportunity and that right, and certainly not having to be shot and turned into an iconic kind of heroic figure. And I think education, in that sense, is the most important thing, whether it's at home or at school. It gives women the tools to communicate and grow the identity that they then want to choose for themselves. I think the bottom line is that we have to teach girls, all children perhaps, but especially girls who are facing enormous obstacles in their opportunities for self-realization and emancipation. We have to teach them to be precocious, and we have to reclaim the word precocious as well as the word feminist and make that part of our mission. So that.
This errant path and the good path, the right path. I mean, you know, what I see happening to you and your really impassioned and clear conviction about giving yourself as a person to the cause of gender equality. Did that come together at a moment in your life? I mean, did you suddenly realise that you had that campaigning commitment and that you had the tools, you know, and the platform to be able to use it at a certain moment?
Well, I visited this IDP camp in Chad. Oh God, it must have been about 8 or 10 years ago, which rather weirdly was as part of a trip organised by my husband for these great African women, these amazing role models, Ngozi, the head of the vice president of the World Bank, and it was just a group of Mary Robinson, went president of Ireland. Anyway, there was these wonderful women there, and we went to this camp and we sat and we listened to a woman tell us the story of why she was in the camp. And she'd been in her village when the Janjaweed had ridden into the village, the rebels in southern Sudan. And she had seen her husband killed. And she had been holding her baby in her arms and they'd decapitated her baby in her arms. And then she'd been moved to a camp to service these men who'd killed her family. And she was kept there for 6 weeks. And she finally, when they'd finished with her, really sort of thrown out, probably as close to death as she'd ever been, and managed to struggle and find her way to this IDP camp. And in the time that she'd been there, she'd had a baby. She'd had a baby girl, the father of which was one of the many, 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 many men who'd raped her during the 6 weeks she was in that camp. And as she sat there with her daughter, she talked to us, and we were all weeping. It was just impossible situation. And she said that she didn't really care at all what happened to her anymore, as you can understand after the experience she'd had. But what she wanted was a future for her daughter, and that was all that mattered to her. And I think in that moment, sorry, I just thought it upset me. In that moment, I just thought, you know, yes, it's great to come out here and you look at these fantastic women and you see what African women can achieve, but I can't sit by and not do anything anymore while the fate of this woman and millions like her remains, that she has no future for her daughter. She knows that. She knows that her daughter is destined to exactly, potentially the same experience as her, and all she wanted to see her have was an education. And on a trip to Mozambique that we went on, there was another woman, more heartwarmingly, who I sat and talked to, who was part of this collective of women farmers who were working together and had developed all these means of keeping the money, which is a major problem, particularly in Mozambique. Domestic violence is a big problem, and also men not doing anything and then taking the money that women earn. And so they developed this way of sort of keeping the money and hiding it in different houses and moving it all the time amongst the cooperative. And they'd managed to send their daughters to school as a result of this cooperative, which they'd all been part of for about, I think it was about 15 years, 18 years. And this woman was my age and looked at least 30 years older. She was exhausted. And I said, what do you think about when you're out in the field, you know, you're working this incredibly hard labor, you know, with hoes, nothing mechanized, nothing. And she said, you know, I think about my daughter, and I think about her sitting on the Croisette in Maputo. She works for a lawyer, and I think about her having a coffee, and I just get back down and start digging again. And, you know, both of those experiences are really what propelled me into just an absolute, you know, desire to take action.